Hello and welcome. My name is KG. I'm a public historian and the host of The Movements, a podcast history of the masses. On Wednesday, July 1st, 2020, I hosted an abolitionist webinar and question and answer session with Jessica Bettencourt and Stephen Jones. The Movements is an audiobook-style leftist history podcast covering liberation struggle and revolutions. At the end of this webinar, I'll play a 4-minute excerpt from my upcoming episode, The Guatemalan and Cuban Revolutions Part 1, The Latin Spring. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. And now, on to the webinar.
Ms. Bettencourt is also a member of the UAW Local 2325, the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, and an active participant with 5 borough defenders. And then after Jessica speaks, we'll have Stephen Jones speak for a little bit. Stephen is a PhD candidate specializing in the history and geography of the security housing unit in California prisons. His work describes the reconfiguration of liberal post-war policies intended for rehabilitation into tools for repression, focusing on the California Department of Corrections. And then after that, we'll go and take questions, which you can go ahead and type into the chat box. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jessica.
Good evening, everyone. So as KG let us know, I'm a public defender and attorney. I practice right now in New York City, and because I'm an attorney, before I start, I'm going to tell you I'm speaking for myself and not my organization. Please don't go out there and say that I spoke for anyone but me. But my hope tonight is to give you all a little bit of context kind of about where we are now and what things kind of actually look like now. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what courts are like now and kind of how they've evolved and responded in recent years, as well as police and where they are now, and then talk about what police accountability kind of looks like as it is and some of the challenges that we have now. So, I primarily practice in New York City. I have some experience in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and DC. But one thing to note is that most of what I talk about and most of what I know comes from an urban area, which can actually make a really big difference, as you might imagine, across the country. I'm used to big police departments that are well-funded and big courts with lots of diversity, and that can look really different across the country. But the problems are often pretty much the same. So to chime in about what courts are like now, my first plea is that all of you should go to a court. If you, when COVID is a little safer here, actually going to a court and seeing and court watching either formally or with a form or an informal time just on your own can really expose you to the entire system and show you and illuminate a lot about the legal system. But the first thing that anyone who goes to any court in the United States is going to realize is that pretty much every defendant, pretty much every person who's been arrested is Black or brown. And that includes in areas that are primarily white in this country. Somehow they've still managed to only find and arrest Black and brown folks. The other narrative of courts and kind of the legal system and police as a whole right now is it can also be looked at through money. The people who get arrested tend to be poor or tend to have less power in our system. And so all of those people kind of get scooped up and dumped into a courthouse system that is an adversarial system. People think about courts and the police as like a conflict resolution model sometimes, and as a way to work out problems. But overall, courts and police kind of are terrible at any kind of actual conflict resolution or problem solving. It's a system that's adversarial. It's a system of the state on one side versus a defendant, a person on the other, which is already a pretty big power imbalance. But one thing a lot of people don't realize is our current legal system isn't victim-centered or survivor-centered at all. A lot of times people think about, I'm calling the police because I've been hurt and I'm a victim, and then I'm gonna go to court and get justice for myself, and the prosecutor is gonna be my lawyer or represent me. We hear people a lot come in and say, well, I talked to my lawyer, and they're talking about a prosecutor or district attorney. And that's just not how it works. In our legal system, there's pretty much no formal role for anyone who's been harmed. You're a witness, you can come in and talk. In some states, you can come in and give a statement if someone is found guilty. You can talk to a prosecutor or a judge about what you might want to have happen. But our system is not actually focused on justice or on victims or harm at all. It's focused on process. It's focused on legal technicalities. It's focused on law. One thing that people often don't realize is whenever you come to court, there's very little talking about what actually happened. At a trial, you might see somebody talking about what actually happened and about facts, but most of the time people are talking about process. They're talking about how paperwork was done, whether police followed a checklist that they were supposed to do, whether prosecutors wrote paperwork correctly. And there's very little focus on any kind of actual problem or anything that actually happened until maybe at a trial stage. But the other thing that if you go to a court and watch, you'll learn pretty quickly is that pretty much nothing goes to trial in our system. For a lot of reasons, including police, about 98% of cases in the United States take guilty pleas. So what that means is that most people who are arrested anywhere in the United States come to court and they never actually get to a trial. We never actually have that process that happens on, Law and Order that everyone envisions in court, where witnesses come in and there's a jury and people talk about the facts and sort out what actually happened. It just doesn't happen that way. Most of the time, a prosecutor makes an offer to someone. It's often less than whatever they were arrested for. So maybe you're arrested for, a felony for hitting someone, but in the end, you take a plea or say you're guilty or cop out to a misdemeanor. And our system is set up to drive that. Most of the time, that's because people are in jail or they can't keep coming back to court or they're scared about what could happen later. And so they take a plea and end their case and never go to trial. And that has a lot of consequences, not only just for courts, but for police as well. It means that 98% of the time, no one's actually challenging what happened with police and whether they did things correctly. The other thing sometimes people ask about is, we're getting rid of police, but isn't it possible just to change things in the system or solve things? And the other thing to know about how courts function is there has been a trend towards trying to not be as punitive. That's been a big trend in the last 5 to 10 years. The number of people incarcerated has plummeted in the last 5 years or so. It spiked way high in the 90s, but has come back down a little bit now. And in the last 5 years, there's been just an incredible change in how people think about courts and the legal system and police, and a big trend towards things like getting rid of bail or closing down prisons. So that's really changed courts and the atmosphere somewhat. There's also been a trend towards the kind of things that people call problem-solving courts, which is drug court or mental health court or diversion or community service, all ways to try and take the jail or the punishment out of court. Unfortunately, in the current system, those things often still don't happen. Programs cost money. They're wildly vary in how well they're put out there and how well they're run. And, it's frankly still pretty punitive. If you're getting arrested and dragged into jail in order to go to a program or a treatment option, that still looks a lot like punishment to most people. So courts as a whole are kind of, in a lot of ways, a rubber stamping process. And that's important when we talk about what police are like now, because a lot of people have the sense that courts and the legal system are somehow separate or somehow a check and a balance on police, but that's not really where we are. So police and law enforcement now are really powerful. Most people, especially most white people, think about police as still like a helpful person, a person you call if you need help, things like that. That's obviously not true for most Black or brown people in the country, but for a large portion of the country, it is. And when we talk about police, we also have to talk about law enforcement more broadly. It's not just your local police or NYPD, it's also ICE or TSA or the FBI. All of those things are police and law enforcement. And there is a lot of money in law enforcement. There's money in jails. There's lots of money to local law enforcement. NYPD's budget is about $6 billion a year. That's important because, for context, that's about 3 times the size of the New York City Fire Department's budget. There are just thousands and thousands of sworn police officers in the country. In New York City, there are 36,000 NYPD employees, which is basically the size of the entire United States active duty Coast Guard for comparison. And a city and countrywide, there are about 800,000 law enforcement. And what law enforcement looks like varies widely. In larger cities, most police officers have 6 months to a year of starting training. Often nowadays, there's a big emphasis on diversity in police forces in urban areas. There's a lot of talk now about, oh, can't we just train the police or educate them? But the fact is, in most of the country, in larger police departments, most police officers already have college degrees. The days of like going to high school and just becoming a cop are really over at this point for the larger police departments. So we just have these broad, very expensive police departments that have a lot of people in them and are really heavily armed. And they, really aren't trained in any kind of de-escalation techniques. And it's also kind of hard to know what goes on in police departments. Police keep all of their own stats. If you go looking for statistics on, say, how many cases NYPD or your local police department actually solves or handles, all of the numbers are reported just by police, which obviously has some issues there, right? If all the data we're looking at comes from the people we're trying to look at or trying to keep accountable, well, we don't even know if the data is accurate. What we do know is that what people think about what police do is not what they do. People often think, my house gets broken into, and then I call the police and they arrive right away, and then they investigate, they use like all the tools they have on CSI, and then they catch the person who did this thing and bring them to jail where they have a trial. And that's pretty much not what happens. Police actually clear or solve remarkably few cases in this country. Something like over 1/3 of all homicides nationwide go unsolved. And that sounds even worse when you think about the fact that in most cases, in most violent crimes, and most harmful interactions in general, people actually know each other. And the numbers for homicides and clearance rates and solving rates are actually way higher than they are for anything else. Actual arrest rates for things like rape or sexual assault hover below 50%. For something like theft, like maybe stealing a car, those rates are around about 13%. So a lot of times, or burglary, breaking into a house, again, around 13%. So a lot of times police turn up, they see your broken window, they take a report, and nothing else happens. So, I think people often think about what they want from police or how they act, but the reality is nothing like you see on CSI or on TV. Police pretty much don't solve most things. And as I think we've all seen in the news, they can be pretty violent when they do turn up. And overwhelmingly, they're violent towards poor people, people of color. So now a lot of people are talking more and more about police abolition. And one thing that I get asked a lot is, well, aren't there other ways to hold police accountable? And I'm going to hit the highlights of what those ways are and how they work right now. Big one that everybody talks about, body cameras. Let's watch what the cops are doing. Body cameras are now widely used. That's really new. In New York City, body cameras, when I started 6 years ago, non-existent. Now pretty much every officer wears a body camera. Body cameras have proven completely useless in holding anyone accountable. Police don't care if they're filmed doing things like planting evidence or shooting people. Police also generally control whether or not their body camera is recorded and recording at certain times, which has obvious issues. Police also have access to all of the materials. So body cameras, not terribly useful on a systemic level. Then sometimes you hear, well, what about, criminal courts? Don't judges and prosecutors and attorneys and those courts hold police accountable? Pretty much no. From a defense attorney perspective, sometimes, we win a case and our client, who is innocent or has been hurt by the police, doesn't go to jail. We try to keep stats and publicize things about bad police officers, but realistically, defense attorneys work on a very individual level. We got no power to actually hold police accountable. Judges just suck at holding police accountable. Frankly, they don't really want to. Many of them are former prosecutors nationwide. They tend to believe police officers. Police officers also present themselves in court better than many witnesses that are not police officers. They're trained to testify or test a lie. And even when judges or courts say, oh, a cop is lying or a cop wasn't telling the whole truth, nothing is done about it. I've had cases where we have had judges find that police are lying or basically on the stand or are not believable. My case might get dismissed. Nothing happens to the police officer. Prosecutors, district attorneys. Honestly, the idea of them holding police accountable is laughable. Prosecutors, even progressive prosecutors, rely on police departments as their main witnesses. They work hand in hand with them. Prosecutors tend to view everything that happens that is about bad police on an individual level. When we talk about like the Innocence Project and overturning old cases for problems, they tend to overturn one case but not look at the other, 10,000 cases the officer did. Prosecutors across the country keep lists of officers they don't believe are good officers or officers they found that they don't trust. They still keep calling those officers and prosecuting those cases. And as for actually prosecuting police officers, we've seen how well that worked. The excellent example would be Officer Pantaleo, who killed Eric Garner in New York City. They arrested him eventually, but never got past a grand jury. And frankly, there's a saying in law that like prosecutors can indict a ham sandwich. They can indict anything except a cop. So, criminal courts not holding anybody accountable. Then you've got like lawsuits. People are also often like, okay, maybe we can sue the police. Pretty much a no-go as well. Cities pay out a lot of money for police misconduct. New York City paid over $230 million last year for police misconduct and settlements, but police have what's called qualified immunity, which is basically a big fancy term for the Supreme Court and federal law says if a cop is acting as in his job, you can't get any money out of them. Their department, their city, the government might be liable, but the individual officer doesn't pay a cent, which obviously means there's no real incentive there. There are police review boards across the country, largely ineffective. Most of the time, they don't have any actual power. We see that in New York City. Even if you refer something to them, it almost never gets actual power. Police lose vacation days, not their jobs. And one of the big hurdles that people often hear about, police unions. Police unions are very powerful. I'm a union girl. I love my union, but police unions and correction unions basically function as political machines to buy off politicians about power and keep police from any kind of accountability. And that's a major problem countrywide. So basically the state of things, to sum up, is police are largely lawless and the systems that we have don't really help people who have been harmed in any ways. There are different models across the world. I'll let Stephen talk more about what police abolition can look like, but as a teaser, unarmed police are a big thing. Decriminalizing things, we've seen that with marijuana, simply just making things not crimes can have a big effect. And there have social workers or trained medical professionals to respond to health crises is a big one. Or restorative justice, which is a formal process that talks more about alleviating harm between people and in communities. And also, frankly, a big part of changing police and getting rid of police and abolishing them is simply to solve the societal problems that we use police to regulate. Things like homelessness, things like crime or violent crime or domestic violence. All of those have causes and things that we know about that we can solve in other ways. So that would be my pitch. My pitch would be currently what we have not working, and there are a lot of other things we could try.
All right, thank you so much, Jess. All right, Stephen, let's hand it over to you.
Hey everyone, my name's Stephen Jones. I just turned my video on. Thanks so much, KG, for inviting me to come and talk. And Jess, it was great to hear you. I'm really glad to be talking on this occasion, both to celebrate the ongoing rebellion that we're living through, and also hopefully to plot a way forward to a world beyond walls and cages and beyond armed police. So first, this is basically the structure of my talk. I'm going to make some brief remarks contextualizing where we're at, and then I'm going to give an example from my own research, a case study about reform, and then I will end by pointing out some abolitionist organizations around the US that you guys might want to check out more. And throughout my remarks, I'm going to be making some reading recommendations. So if you're interested in further reading, you might want to note that down as I go along. So we are standing at the intersection of at least 3 crises: a public health crisis, a political economic crisis, and a crisis of racism and police violence. In the midst of the first 2 crises, our government at all levels has proven to us that they are incapable of protecting us either from COVID or mass unemployment. And in the midst of that, the police have shown that they are incapable of stopping killing Black people. But as people have come out to the streets in mass to declare that Black Lives Matter, the state and the federal state, each state, each city and the federal state have shown that they are entirely capable of mobilizing immense resources of policing and military might to, in the attempt to smash open revolt. Here in New York City, one of the most sort of succinct examples of that is an image that many of us saw of hospital workers in a public hospital wearing trash bags because of a shortage of protective equipment. And that contrasted with the extremely well-equipped and heavily armed riot police brutalizing protesters in the streets. So each of the police killings that we've witnessed in the past month, I think gives us a window to catch a glimpse of the scale and the scope of the institutions of organized violence, which is to say the police, prisons, and courts. So first off, because we have seen these killings, because they have risen to the surface, that tells us that the police actually kill a lot of people. The police kill somebody on average every 8 hours. And as the Black Lives Matter movement shows us, if we can stop the police from killing Black people, we can stop them from killing other people too. But I'm going to pick out 3 of the most prominent examples from the last month and sort of raise up what each of those instances can tell us about the conditions that we're facing. So first of all, George Floyd in Minneapolis. We know that the employee who worked at Cup Foods, which is the convenience store where Floyd allegedly passed a counterfeit bill, was mandated by municipal law to call the police when he suspected a crime. And this is something called a nuisance abatement law, which is widespread across the country. And many stores in poor neighborhoods are mandated to abide by these laws. and they can lose their business license and be closed down if they do not report crimes and operate as deputies of the police agencies. The second case that I will raise up is Brianna Taylor, who was killed in her home in Louisville, Kentucky. And the police entered her home with the authority of something called a no-knock warrant. No-knock raids are also very common in the US. Police departments in many cities use these extremely violent measures to serve arrest warrants. And no-knock raids kill a lot of people. And part of that is because more than 40% of households in the United States have guns inside of them. And this includes the household that Brianna Taylor was in. As we know, her partner reached for his gun when the police smashed open the door and rushed in, probably assuming that it was a burglar and that he had every right under US law to defend himself and his home. And then the third example is Rashard Brooks, who was shot and killed in the Wendy's drive-thru in Atlanta. We know that Brooks was on parole and that his DUI arrest would probably have landed him in prison again for a long and life-shortening term. Now, Georgia has an extremely high incarceration rate, and more than 400,000 people are on parole there. Truly a staggering number of people, and Rashard Brooks was one of those people. In Georgia, it's very, very difficult to get off of parole, and parole is extremely punitive, and it has all sorts of restrictions for jobs and housing and other things that are necessary. So all of these facts show us both the scope of police, prisons, and courts, and also the weight that these things have on working communities and poor communities of color. And as Jess just touched on and illuminated us about, the police spend most of their time doing things that could easily be taken care of by other workers who aren't armed and aren't trained to harm or kill people. In fact, the police spend very little of their time dealing with so-called violent crime compared to things like responding to domestic disputes, harassing people who are hanging out in public for a variety of reasons, and dealing with something that the cops euphemistically refer to as EDPs, which is short for emotionally disturbed persons. This is squarely a police term. And these people are people who are in crisis as a result of maybe psychiatric problems or substance use or any other reason. And I think it's important to note that in many professional police publications, the police say similar things to abolitionists. They say that we live in a broken society, that our governments have completely abdicated their responsibility to mental health, public health, poverty, and the like. And because of those things, their working conditions are unpleasant and dangerous. So these are the sorts of things that police themselves say about the conditions that they face. They know, and we know, that the police are not well equipped to deal with the problems that they encounter. And this is very easy to understand if we simply take a look at the tools that they have around their belts, right? They're violence workers, first and foremost. And if you want to read a little bit more about that, an excellent book that I would recommend is called Police, a Field Guide. Police, a Field Guide, which is by David Correa and Tyler Wall. And, you know, on the topic of police as violence workers, it's also important to note that police are some of the greatest purveyors of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as physical violence. In a book that I'll recommend on that topic is entitled Captive Genders. It's an edited collection by Eric Stanley and Nat Smith, Captive Genders. So the conditions that we are living through that I've just sort of very briefly touched on, the enormous growth of police departments, the enormous growth of prisons, and the laws that govern both police departments and fill prisons. These are all the outcome of the last major crisis in the United States. And if you want to understand how we got here, where we are now, I would recommend that you read Ghoul Egg, which is by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. This book, in my mind, is required reading for anybody who's interested in racism and capitalism and how to struggle against it. It's really, really, really important. I recommend that you read it with a group of friends and get together and discuss it, because it's often a difficult book and it's extremely important. But for now, I'll summarize in the simplest terms what Professor Gilmore shows us. She shows that police and prisons are not a mechanistic response to crime, because, as Gilmore shows, crime of all sorts began falling in 1980 before the prison boom, before mass incarceration as we know it. Instead, these institutions are about managing capitalist crisis. So what do I mean by that? In the late 60s and the early 70s, there was a crisis of profitability in the capitalist world that was resolved in part by a geographical reorganization of capital. So automation, downsizing, and capital movement to the US Southeast, Northern Mexico, Southeast Asia, and other regions are part of that geographical reorganization. And these displacements left many places and many people abandoned, at the same time that the state at all levels shrugged off its responsibility to provide social welfare. So prisons and police have stepped into the void left behind by organized abandonment. They have become catch-all solutions to social and economic problems in places like these. Organized violence is intended to manage the explosive conditions produced by organized abandonment, produced by capitalist crisis. Now, police and prisons were definitely not the only possible outcome to these crises, and they are still not the only possible outcome. When a company leaves a place, the people that are left behind, the land that is empty, and the capital that is idled, all of these things can be put back together to build anything, to build a school, to build a hospital, to build a park or a museum. But instead, as Gilmore shows us in Ghoul Egg, in California and elsewhere, the prison guards union, local business leaders, both Republican and Democratic lawmakers, and so-called victims' rights groups joined forces to use these resources to build and fill prison after prison after prison. And if you want to learn about specifically the guards unions, I would recommend a book called The Toughest Beat by Joshua Page. And as I would tell my students about this book, The Toughest Beat is not about how evil the guards union is, although that may be true. Instead, this book is about how the guards won, how they became so powerfully politically. And as a result, it also offers a potential strategic roadmap for anybody who is looking to build the political power necessary to do other things with those idle resources, things other than lock people up. So everybody knows that the institutions of organized violence don't prevent harm. They don't solve the problems of poverty. They don't solve the problems of interpersonal harm. Everybody knows this. Instead, these institutions harass people, they cage people, they kill people and displace people from their communities. And they also prevent individuals from accessing employment, from accessing housing and other life-sustaining resources. None of these things fixes any of the conditions that led a person to perpetrate harm or steal something or whatever the hell made them come under the thumb of the police. And in fact, all of these things exacerbate those problems. In Golden Gulag, Gilmore quotes the anthropologist Alan Feldman, who has a very illuminating and succinct quote on this topic. Feldman writes that arrest is the political art of individualizing disorder. The political art of individualizing disorder. So what the police do when they arrest somebody is that they show the people in the community, the people who watch the nightly news, that our problem are those people who are getting arrested. Our problem is poor people. Our problem is people of color. When, in fact, the problem is much, much larger than that and is, in fact, a structural problem. So, facing all of those inadequacies and tragedies, what do abolitionists do? Abolitionists seek and work to build the kinds of relationships and structures that actually prevent harm and or redress it when it happens. To that end, abolitionists fight for something called non-reformist reforms, which is to say reforms that shrink the size and power of police, prisons, and courts. And as Jess pointed out just a few minutes ago, body cameras, community policing, and something like implicit bias training are the opposite of these things. Each of those reforms funnel even more resources into police departments and corrections budgets. And if you want to read about the lie of community policing, this is the last book I'll recommend. Policing the Planet is an excellent text that discusses community policing, and it was published in the wake of the last uprising in 2014 and 2015. Policing the Planet, which is edited by Jordan Camp and Christina Heatherton. So I'll pivot now and tell a reformist story from my own research. And then after that, I'll point to a number of specific abolitionist organizations that you might want to check out if you're interested in learning more about this stuff. So in California, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the corrections department was a national leader in, so-called liberal corrections. And what they were interested in was rehabilitating people who had committed crimes. And in order to do this, they provided remedial education because they found that many people who were getting locked up were not well educated, they were modestly educated. So they provided elementary and high school education. They also provided vocational training to people with the understanding that if they could get a job, then maybe they could be, as it said, productive members of society. And they also very much encouraged literacy. The libraries in prisons at this time were, much fuller than they are now. And they encouraged prisoners to read books of all sorts. So that sounds maybe good to some who are listening, but in fact, it really did not turn out to have that rehabilitative intent at all. On the one hand, prisoners who were being educated and who were reading widely armed themselves with that knowledge and struggled against being locked up in a cage, right? All of these social welfare resources, education, job training, housing, right, which is what they were getting, although coercively in prison. All of these things can be provided to people without locking them up and forcing them to live in a crowded prison. So as people were getting educated, as they were educating themselves and each other, forming reading groups, they trained themselves to become something that's called jailhouse lawyers. And they sued their State Department of Corrections in federal courts over and over and over and over again for things like crowding, unsanitary conditions, brutality by guards, unsanitary food, and things like that. And they won a lot. Federal courts sided consistently with prisoners, in fact, and forced State Department of Corrections to redress their bad conditions. Direct action. Prisoners of all sorts banded together to train themselves and each other with political education and direct action. Prisoners went on strike. They shut down the prisons. They, some of them in California as elsewhere, directly attacked guards who were attacking them. And they organized with people on the outside to, to host simultaneous rallies. So people would be demonstrating on the outside of the prison walls at the same time the prisoners were shutting down prison by sitting down in their cells and refusing to go out to work. And people were rebelling because the liberal reforms that were introduced in California and elsewhere were both not carried out because prisons remained punitive places that were crowded and unsanitary and violent, because the primary purpose of prison is to punish people and control them, not to educate them, not to give them job training. And that reformist gloss simply couldn't cover up what the real intent of confinement was and is. So I'll close, as I said, by pointing out a few abolitionist organizations. One of the great national organizations is a group called Critical Resistance, and they provide a consistent abolitionist analysis. I always consult with them and read what they have to say about whatever is going on and the many campaigns that they wage. And it's also useful to take a look at the organizations in Minneapolis, because part of the reason why things popped off the way that they did in Minneapolis is because there is such a well-organized and long-standing movement there, both an abolitionist movement and also movements around housing and other things like that. So one of the strongest organizations in that regard is an organization called Reclaim the Block. Reclaim the Block. I would definitely recommend checking out their website and their general campaign. And many of the organizations in Minneapolis banded together to produce something called the MPD 150 report, which was a people's performance review of the Minneapolis Police Department on their 150th anniversary. So the report deals with the origins of the Minneapolis Police Department and the history of its abuses, and it talks about the conditions that people in Minneapolis face today. And then perhaps most importantly for our discussion tonight, the report points to the future and gives some very concrete examples about what is to be done to prevent harm instead of relying on police and prisons. And I'm definitely happy to answer questions that are asking for more specifics in this regard, but I wanted to keep it general for now and just sort of point to these organizations. And it's also useful to state that many of the abolitionist alternatives to police departments are different place to place. Many activists and organizers are sort of opposed to a model approach, which is to say a one-size-fits-all approach that can be implemented regardless of the specific conditions that people face in their neighborhoods and states. And instead, it sort of comes out through material practice, right? What organizations exist in those places, what relationships in the communities are like, and what resources people have, what training they have in de-escalation, in first aid response, and things like that. But regardless, I could point out some things if y'all are interested in. But anyway, I would definitely encourage you, wherever you are, to get to know the organizations in your city. And with that, I'll pause, and I look forward to any questions that you all might have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So we are going to move on to the questions segment of the evening. I'm going to ask everybody to type their questions into the chat box. You can either do it publicly to everybody else on the call, or you can send it privately to me, to KG, and I'll go ahead and ask it. But I'll get us started off with my own question. So, and either of you can answer this. So I think for me, one of the things that was important in my journey as becoming a police abolitionist and a prison abolitionist as well, abolish it all, is learning. So, you know, I'm Guatemalan, and my parents are immigrants. I have a lot of undocumented people in my family. So I think I sort of grew up with a natural aversion and fear and nervousness around police officers that, you know, has only been reinforced by the few times in which I had ever felt compelled to actually call them or to talk to them. Have not done much to show me otherwise. But I think there's always been a sense of inevitability of like, well, they exist, they've always existed. Like, you're not going to have a world where they don't exist. But I think for myself, discovering that there was a link between historical conditions in capitalist development and the creation of police forces. Like, police didn't exist, at least in their modern form, until the last couple hundred years with the development of cities and factories and industry and concentration of people and that sort of thing. So I guess my sort of question is, if you could give a little bit of an explanation or talk a little bit about what are the actual functions of police, like putting aside what we think it is, protect and serve, put that aside entirely. What do police actually do, and what is the function that they serve?
So I guess I can jump in a little bit about what police actually do on a day-to-day basis. Before I do, I'd also jump in that police don't just have a capitalist history. They also, in the United States, have a direct line from slavery. The first police forces in the United States largely were slave-catching forces, and arguably still are. But as for what police actually do on a daily basis, the majority of what police do is very minor level things. So in New York City, police officers on like a basic shift, they turn up at the police station, they have like a roll call meeting, and most police officers do some kind of patrol. That means a day-to-day, you know, there are some specialized police and specialized units, but most police officers get in the car and drive around and either respond to 911 call dispatches or look out on the streets and zoom up to things when they see problems. And, you know, I think in the old days, that was like walking the beat. It's not quite the same nowadays, but basically most police officers drive around looking for trouble. Most of the time what police officers do, you know, they respond to a lot of car accidents. You know, like when you think about getting in any kind of a car accident, they turn up and they like help make sure everybody gets insurance. They do a fair amount of calling other services. In most cities or in most locations in the US, police are the most local and first arriving first responder. If you call 911 for a medical crisis in most of the United States, the first person to show up will be a police officer. And, you know, sometimes that means they are dealing with people that they call EDPs, people who might be in a mental health crisis. Sometimes they're literally giving CPR. That actually happens more than you think, or basic first aid. Police also spend a lot of time writing traffic tickets and making money for cities that way. In smaller, more rural areas, like cities and towns literally run on traffic ticket money. So they spend a lot of time doing that. And then they largely enforce minor level laws. They turn up an awful lot to stores for shoplifting. In New York City and in other areas, they spend a lot of time moving homeless people or moving people that people don't want to see, whether they're homeless people or protesters or someone on your street maybe that's trespassing, moving those people away from wherever they're located. And they spend a lot of time responding to fights of all kinds. And that's most of their time. Very few police actually do any kind of investigating on a day-to-day basis. There are detectives. They theoretically do a lot of investigating. Most of the time that's calling people and writing reports, or sending information or evidence collection to a more specialized unit. And then police spend a lot of time writing paperwork. Every police officer you ever talk about will bitch about the amount of paperwork they have to do. They spend a lot of time writing things down for lawyers to look at. And so I don't know if that answers your question, KG, but that's what a police day looks like. It's mostly paperwork and minor level dispute resolution and enforcement.
Thanks for that. Stephen, did you have anything to add, or shall we move on?
Yeah, I'll jump in briefly by first saying, Jess, that's an excellent answer. I really appreciate the specificity that you brought to it. And I'll just say in a broader sense that the answer to the question of what do police do, in the simplest terms, what police do is that they protect capital and that they enforce racial hierarchies. That's the simplest way to I think really sum it up. And looking back historically, the first professional police organization in the United States emerged in the mid-19th century in Charleston, South Carolina. And it sort of grew out of informal and ad hoc militias and slave patrols, as Jess just mentioned. And they became professionalized and institutionalized at a time when enslaved people were increasingly working off of the plantation. They were working in handicrafts and sometimes in industrial outfits as well in cities. And so police organizations emerged in order to manage the political problem of open revolt by these workers. And in the North, that was certainly the case in many places as well, but the police historically have also been the enemy of the working class, fighting for rights of all sorts. So yeah, that's what I'll say for that.
Great. All right. So, on the subject of capitalism and the police serving to protect the interests of capital, the next question goes great into that theme. So the question is, how do you expect this movement to be impacted by widespread evictions of Black and brown people in the coming months?
I can speak to that a little bit. You're very right to point out the looming threat of evictions, and it's important also, I think, to state that tens of thousands of people in New York are on rent strike right now. It's the largest rent strike that has happened in this city in several decades, and I think that one of the reasons why the mass protests against police violence have really popped off as they have is because of the economic and political conditions that we've been living through for the last 3 months as the result of COVID and the economic and political response to it. So because people were asked to stay home, because people were laid off, because people found how onerous and hard to navigate unemployment agencies are, and all of these reasons, the contradictions that were already present in many poor people and working people's lives have been generalized to a great extent, right? And people have been, to a certain extent, radicalized by their experience in the last 3 months. And evictions and the refusal of state and city governments to cancel rent or provide any meaningful relief to tenants is a big part of that.
So I would jump in, I think, with two thoughts about how evictions are going to impact this movement. First, on just a very micro level, anytime you're going to see evictions go up, you're going to see policing and arrests go up. We criminalize poverty and homelessness specifically in a lot of ways. If you think about arresting people for begging or trespassing, like sleeping in buildings, or pretty much every other administrative code, peeing in public, all of those things directly impact people who no longer have stable housing. So on a micro level, logistically, evictions just are a mess and always lead to criminalization. I think you're also going to see a greater realization of how police are used directly to enforce capital and capitalism. Police and sheriffs do evictions. So every time you see an eviction order noticed, a police officer with a gun is going to show up and be the people physically making sure someone leaves in most of the country. And those situations, unfortunately, are often end up with a lot of police violence. So I think you're also going to see a greater realization of how police directly protect landlords and things like that coming out of this.
Thank you both. And I think I'm just going to add to this, because, movements happens to be my field of expertise, that I think one of the aspects of this that I find interesting is the impact that COVID-19 has had across different levels of affluence within people of color. So, speaking as a Guatemalan, I think something that's interesting is that, so for those of us who come to the United States or have been here for a while, oftentimes we've been here for a while, we succeed, we start developing a little bit of we have some property here, maybe we even get a 401k. Oftentimes that causes, certain oppressed communities to start to have different, mixed relationships with our governments, with our police, that sort of thing. And I think one of the things we're going to be seeing in the coming months is, because this is going to be bringing down so much pressure and so much on top of everything else, when people start getting mass evicted, when unemployment insurance, the extension, whether or not they extend that when that starts to run out, all those added pressures on top of each other, I think altogether is going to erode a lot of trust. So for example, some lower middle class, Latinos, other people of color, all kinds of different people suddenly experiencing oh, I thought that if I worked hard and I followed the law and I did everything right, that we'll start to be treated better, that we'll have a higher standard of living, all this, the meritocracy myth. And I think all of this is so connected to the role that police play in our society. So I think not just on police, but I wouldn't be surprised if you see the seeds of a lot of people, not just the most poor working class, but even the more privileged among us, starting to get more frustrated and more willing to question certain things like the existence of modern policing. All right, so the next question here is, aside from writing to my local elected officials and working to vote out those who are strongly tied to the police, what are the most important things the average citizen can do to, one, stop the money going to the police, and two, work towards abolition?
That's a great question. I think you named two of the big ones, which are holding elected officials accountable if you're working within the system. I think we've seen, frankly, that mass protests and civil disobedience have been incredibly effective in the recent months. We've seen certainly a higher level of consciousness and at least lip service towards police abolition. So I think that's a big one. I mean, I think as a public defender, I would say the most important thing any one person can do to work towards police abolition is not call the police. And that sounds really easy in theory. You're just like, sure, I won't call the police, but it really means rethinking how you live in and work in your communities. It means rethinking what you do if you feel unsafe. It means rethinking how you respond to someone in crisis. It means building stronger ties in your direct community. And I mean, like, on a very micro level, it means getting to know the neighbor in your building so that if there's a problem or a noise complaint, you have a way to go that doesn't involve law enforcement. And really committing to that goal, to not utilizing police services seems small, but if everyone does it, is an incredibly impactful action.
Yeah, definitely. I would echo that. This is such a important question, and I'm really glad that somebody raised it. I think that the protests that have gone on in the last month have been so incredibly amazing and have definitely scared the shit out of elected officials. And you can see it because they're scrambling to respond and or diffuse the movements, right? But in my opinion, the path towards abolition is going to be settled by organizations. So at the end of my remarks, I pointed out a few abolitionist organizations in a couple cities, and I'll underline that again by urging you guys to get to know many, or whatever organizations there are where you live, and think about the types of campaigns that they wage. Think about the sort of coalitions that they're in. What other movements are they linking up with? And ask yourself whether or not they are pushing for non-reformist reforms. And in addition to these specific organizations that deal with police and prison abolition, public sector unions, I think, are extremely powerful in this regard. More and more money in city budgets and state budgets is soaked up by corrections and police forces. And this is a direct threat to public employees of all kinds who can do their jobs outside of prisons, unlike prison guards. So transit workers, sanitation workers, potentially, teachers for sure. These are all allies in the fight against police and against corrections and courts. And I'll just point out that the International Longshoremen's and Warehouse Workers Union on the West Coast on Juneteenth shut down, I believe the number was 29 ports on the West Coast for the entire day. This is huge. And the locals in San Francisco and Oakland had previously stopped work for 9 minutes a couple times in solidarity with the protesters in Minneapolis, 9 minutes being about the amount of time that the cop in Minneapolis put his knee on George Floyd's neck. Another very encouraging development in that regard is the Flight Attendants Union, who that organization is on the executive council of the AFL-CIO. So they are very powerful. And they recently, I think just last week, passed a resolution in which they called for a number of very, very important demands. They called for the end to, militarization of the police, the end of police organizations' participation in military training programs, and also accepting surplus equipment. They called, I believe, for the expulsion of police and guards unions from the labor movement. And they addressed very directly that their membership, flight attendants, have been deputized as a result of securitization of airports and flights, and that this is something that they reject. They don't want to be cops. Teachers don't want to be cops. Flight attendants don't want to be cops. Hospital workers don't want to be cops. And on that note, all sorts of unions across the United States are making demands on the AFL to ramp up the pressure in order to hopefully kick out police unions, which are an enemy to the working class. And of course, we've seen movements by various unions or demands by various unions to kick out cops from schools, from hospitals and things like this. And all that I think is very, very important and should be followed closely.
I just wanted to add one thing, what Jess mentioned about talking to people, talking to your neighbors. I think particularly for those of you who live in gentrifying neighborhoods, who are gentrifiers yourselves, something I cannot stress enough is to go to community meetings, find out who the community organizers are, because I swear to God, in a gentrifying neighborhood, if like somebody like steals the back of somebody's bike, there's a community meeting and all the gentrifiers show up to demand more policing, more beats, more cameras, that sort of thing. And you don't want a situation where you have the gentrifiers, who are the ones with the money, who pay the landlords, who are the ones that the police answer to, having the says at these community meetings. What we really need is for gentrifiers, particularly white gentrifiers, to be working with local activists. So groups affiliated with the groups that Stephen has mentioned, finding out if there's a cop watch organization near you, the kinds of people who actually work in mediation in community and communities getting to know each other, because that's the other thing, is that communities that are dealing with antisocial behavior such as theft or men being toxic and that sort of thing, oftentimes the best way to deal with those problems is within the community, is by people getting to know each other and checking in with each other and that sort of thing. So I would go out of your way to find out, even if maybe these groups seem a little crazy to you, a little wild and radical, meet those people, get to know them, and listen to them. So, all right, moving on to the next question here. How important is it for the abolitionist movement in the US to be in conversation with international struggles against state violence? What international movements or organizations should people who are new to prison and police abolition research or look to as inspiration?
This is a great question, and the answer in my mind is certainly yes. The abolitionist movement is an internationalist movement, and in part, that's because of a recognition that police tactics in the United States are the direct outgrowth of military and counterinsurgency operations by the U.S. military around the world. So a lot of what we're witnessing with the riot cops and all of their so-called less lethal munitions that they deploy on protesters, these weapons and tactics were developed and brought back to the United States as a result of U.S. involvement in colonial settings like Vietnam, Indonesia, and places like that. The police organizations at the federal and state level in the United States have been deployed to countries around the world in order to train police forces. This is often an explicitly anti-communist strategy, but it also happens for other reasons. So the reach, the breadth of the United States prison industrial complex is global, and our movement, as a result, needs to be as well.
I think my answer is immediately yes. I think it's pretty clear that struggles against state violence are a theme across the world. As specifically like groups to look for, I mean, I would say look to any group that has been making change and making waves, from Chile to Hong Kong to more historically. You can even hit up KG's podcast about Guatemala and the Cuban Revolution. All of those movements have made large and radical changes, and all of them really at some level involved a push against state violence. And I think that both historically and in the present day, all of those movements have a lot to teach us about organizing and about how things play out.
Thanks for the plug, Jess. All right, let's see. Next question. And this is a great one. I struggle with the idea of abolition somewhat because what justice currently looks like is arresting, charging, and imprisoning police for killing Black people. I want to abolish prisons and police, but at the same time, I'm out in the streets calling for their arrest, etc. How do we reconcile these two conflicting ideas, i.e., wanting a system that doesn't work in the favor, wanting a system that doesn't work to work in the favor of Black and brown folks because this is our idea of justice?
Oh, that one hits me in the heart. So I should say, before I even give thoughts on this, I'm a white woman, and so that informs how I think about these things, and particularly in regards to this question, I think we do see a lot of Black people in the streets calling for cops to be arrested. I think I have a couple of thoughts. My first thought is just initially, using the system to hold police accountable is turning the system on its head. So the system isn't designed to work that way. So it might be that we're using the system in that we're calling for courts and prosecutors and grand juries and arrests and prison time for police, but merely using that system to hold police accountable is flipping that system on its head. And so I think in some ways that's important to understand. I think I personally would say that I reconcile it like this. I have, over the last decade or so, come around strongly to say I just don't believe in prisons. I don't believe anyone should be in prisons. And I think that they're not good. I think they're horrible. I personally, and this is part of being a white woman, I don't call for police to go to prison because I don't think prisons belong in our society. But I think that we can both view any amount of using the system against the state as a change and as progress, and as people using the power that they do have right now. I also think that we can acknowledge that, this is going to sound like incrementalism because it is, but we can also acknowledge that individual and incremental change can still have effects in the moment. It may not be what we're looking for long term. I think we have to completely reimagine and redesign what we're talking about and what we're thinking about. And there have been incredible people, especially Black femmes, and working on that issue and thinking about how we completely reimagine a new system for many, many decades. But that doesn't mean that things that change right now in front of us in the system don't have real effects on people. A police officer who can't be on the force choking out another person is a real effect for the people he's not killing. A cash bail being eliminated for some offenses is a real change for the people who aren't sitting in jail at that moment. So I think we can both honor change and accountability in the moment using the tools that are available, while ultimately knowing that those tools aren't going to serve us long term.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Jess. And I'll just chime in briefly by saying that perhaps, unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to convict police when they kill people. Police have enormous discretion in their jobs, and they have enormous protections as well. So it's very difficult to lock them up. That's the first thing. The other thing is that, as I mentioned in my remarks, prisons don't solve problems. Putting a cage around a police officer who killed somebody, unfortunately, doesn't do anything to change the conditions that led to that cop having an interaction with the person, and that resulted in that person's death. So defund the police, which is an explicitly abolitionist call, and which is not a catchy political slogan, but is actually the result of decades of scholarship and activism, is a movement and a demand that seeks to redress these problems. By reducing police officers' interaction with people, especially people of color, but all people, we can reduce the likelihood that they'll harm or kill anybody.
Uh, I hate to be the host who keeps adding to things, so what Jess said about incrementalism, it sort of reminded me. So, surprise to everybody here, I'm a bit of a Marxist, and we actually Marxists have a lot of opinions and a lot of theories and ideas about the role of how do you make a revolution in a situation where you have to, I don't want to use the term be realistic, but the reform versus revolution thing, which is a text by Rosa Luxemburg that I highly recommend. And I think the way I want to tie this into this is calling for the police officers' arrest and prosecution in a context where you know that the state will not do it, or that if the state does it, it will be a big deal. I think that's an example of making a reasonable demand, a completely reasonable demand, knowing that the state won't do it, and that being a political, a sort of political weapon that you can use as leverage, as far as changing public opinion through the process of working towards a demand that is completely reasonable. People will then realize, oh, this is complete garbage. Maybe this thing doesn't work. So this is just sort of like my sort of contribution, sort of thinking of, how do we know what to ask for, how much to ask for, that sort of thing. All right, next question here. I've been thinking about the ways in which many of the flimsy and underfunded social services we do have intersect with policing and the penal systems, and the ways that barriers set up to make it harder for people to access support, health benefits that their family needs, also act as modes of state control over disenfranchised populations. How do we as abolitionists make sure that diversion of funding away from overt policing doesn't just create labyrinth social service institutions that continue to have many of the same functions in terms of keeping a population under control? And actually, if I actually want to just quickly address this myself, because I come from a family with a lot of social workers, and I'm friends and have a lot of folks who are involved in various types of care work. And I think that's something that is really, the one thing that I would just say is that it's really important that those systems are being run by the actual care workers themselves, because a lot of them don't really like the way that their the way that their services are run. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There are a lot of best practices that are not actually good for clients, for the population served. There's a lot of limits on things that they can do, and they're just so overworked. I think one of the things that I would say is give care workers control over how their agencies are run, because a lot of them understand and feel really upset by the harm that they sometimes feel that they're doing, because that's just the way the system is set up, and it's either that or get fired or lose their license. So that's just all I wanted to say on that.
So, I mean, I think my initial thought is it's really hard. And where I come down on that is, frankly, I think Stephen spoke earlier about the intersecting crises we're in right now as a country, and that there's more than one crisis going on right now. And I think this question actually speaks to that. We got problems that are bigger than just police. And so I think long term, the answer is we actually have to rethink the way much of our country runs and the way we provide services to people, and the restrictions and hoops that we put on people who receive services. I think we have to go a lot further in uncoupling them. I don't have a good roadmap for you. I can tell you there are abolitionist groups that spend a lot of time talking about that and thinking about that. And I would say that those are places to look. There are people studying that, but I think the real answer here is it's a big problem, and we have to rethink all of those institutions.
Okay, I guess we'll move on to the next question here. This is a good one. If not prison, How would you suggest our system protect us from people like Ted Bundy?
This is the question I get every time I talk about prison and public defense. So I think a couple of things. First, I just want to start by being really clear that Ted Bundy is pretty unusual. And I know that doesn't make your point irrelevant, but I think it's pretty important to know the number of people who actually like kill people, pretty small. The number of people who are like regular, killing a lot of people, even smaller. So in general, like you can wipe out a whole lot of people by just talking about everybody that's not Ted Bundy. I think the biggest thing we can learn about protecting ourselves and specifically about Ted Bundy is almost every person that we hear in those big names like Ted Bundy about is stuff happened to them that was real bad, and they were often failed before they ever got to that point. So it's not a complete answer, but there's all of this work about how like most serial killers had really terrible childhoods or were abused in some ways, and that doesn't excuse what they then went out and did and the harm they caused. But part of the reality is a lot of keeping ourselves safe is doing the work and protecting everyone from the beginning, because that will stop a lot of crime. I also think, and this is maybe not a popular point for abolition, this in general for prisons, I take the position that the reason I'm for prison abolition is that because even to the degree that we believe there are people who might need to be removed from society in some way in order that they do not commit more harm, even to that extent, I think those people are so few and far between that the amount of harm we're causing with our current system outweighs any benefit from restraining those people at this point, which is not a satisfactory answer. But I think we address the other 99% of the problem and then get there. But I think a lot of the answer is we keep ourselves safe by keeping ourselves safe, by having accountability and knowing who's around and taking care of everyone. And a lot of those problems go away on a larger level.
Yeah, for sure. This is a good question. And the California case speaks a lot to this, actually. The fact is that these sorts of sensational instances of murder and serial killers and things like that are extremely rare. And when we look at the history, we see that these cases are held up by victims' rights groups, by the guards union, and by law and order politicians as reasons why we need more punitive sentences, more prisons, and more guards. So that's the history of the three strikes law in California, for example. That's exactly how it went down. And these images, these sensational images that we have in our head about unpredictable violence, right, are masking the reality of prisons, police, and courts, which Jess gave us really, I think, a great picture of. Prisons are not filled with people like Ted Bundy. Prisons are filled with mostly poor people, with Black and brown people and poor white people who got caught up. They didn't kill masses of people. And that's the simple fact.
I'll also throw out there that if we stop focusing on all the other people, the police might actually, or whatever harm reduction force we end up with, might have time to actually do things like track down the Ted Bundys instead of ignoring them. That's another thing that we see. I mean, we don't focus our resources on any of the people that are maybe causing the biggest harm.
I think I'll just quickly add that there are currently, I just quickly looked this up on Wikipedia, there are currently about a little under 2.5, or at least in 2010, it looked like about 2.5 million incarcerated Americans. And Ted Bundy, that would be like what, like 30 people? I think we can probably think of something to take care of, that particular issue. And also, I would also add that, I'm not a psychologist and I don't want to go down that route, but I would say some of the traits that might make somebody a good serial killer, such as a lack of ability to feel empathy towards others, actually is also potentially makes them really good at being a CEO. Anyway, moving on. So we are running on time, but we didn't get to the Q&A as quickly as I had thought. So I will go ahead and ask one more question I have here. So the question is, if I'm all into defunding and abolition, what's the elevator pitch I can give to people in my community if they're on the fence? They recognize the issues, but they are tied to the existence of police.
Okay, I'm gonna let Stephen collect his thoughts because maybe he has a better elevator pitch than I do. So what I do when people are really tied to the idea of police is I ask them what about police they like. What in their minds are police doing that helps them? How do they think police work? And a lot of times what people say is actually the example I used about somebody breaking into your house. And then I walk them through whether or not the police, first of all, actually do the things that they think the police are doing. I walk them through, most people say, someone breaks into my house, I want to call the police to come. Okay, why do you want the police to come? You want the person kicked out of your house, so you're safe. Well, congratulations, police pretty much never actually respond while the person's in the house. You're much better off calling a neighbor. It takes a long time for police to get to you. And then people go, well, I want that person caught. Police don't really do a whole lot of investigation. They really don't clear that many burglaries. It hovers around 15%. So police aren't doing that. What else do you want your house broken into? Frankly, what you probably want is new locks and new doors and new ways to feel safe in your home. And none of those things are provided by police. And I think that frankly is, I think, the answer on almost anything I hear from people. Unless you need a person with a gun to show up, you probably don't need police. And so I think the elevator pitch is listening to what people want and talking with them about whether or not that happens now, and also how to get it without the police officer turning up.
I think that's an excellent approach, asking the people what they actually want, and then being able to point out that those services and those functions are not what the police actually do. Maybe it's because I'm a scholar and more into the long form, but I'm not great at elevator pitches, to be honest. I get tripped up. But if somebody asked me this question, I would probably suggest that the police don't do what they may think that they do. Police don't solve problems. They don't solve the problems that they confront. And there are other agencies and services that can solve those problems. And so defund the police is a call to take some of the money that's being wasted in policing and controlling people and putting it towards the things that actually sustain people's lives, which are housing, healthcare, and education.
I actually think I wanted to add, that's a great point that Stephen just made. I think we talk about defund police like that's the end of the hashtag, but it's not. It's defund police and do other things. It's not abolish police, it's abolish police and create ways to keep our community safer. It's defund the police and spend the money better. And I think that when we don't remember to add the second part is where we lose a lot of people.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so we are going to wrap it up. I'm just going to quickly run through, basically, we've got some other webinars that we'll be working on in the coming weeks, dates to be set, but I would say at the end of the month and in August, we'll be doing a webinar on information and operation security for activists, as well as another webinar on a state within a state, building a socialist civic society through political movements. So follow the movements of Podcast History of Masses on Facebook and Twitter for more information on that. Also, the movements, the actual podcast itself, we do long-form audiobooks, history, audiobooks. We have covered the colonization of Palestine, the Spanish Civil War, the Russian Revolution, and as I mentioned earlier, in the next few days, I'll be premiering the first episode of a series on the Guatemalan and the Cuban revolutions. So in addition to these audiobook style histories, webinars, and upcoming YouTube projects that I'm working on, I would like to ask you to go to patreon.com/movementspod to support this free education that I've been working on, that I'm hoping to expand to a larger audience so that people can have access to this information that is too often sort of relegated to academia or, the fringes of the internet, that sort of thing. But I want to say thanks so much again to Stephen and to Jessica for joining us tonight. Thank you, everybody. I will be making a recording available. Everybody who registered will receive an email with the link to the recording, as well as a list of the resources and the books that were referenced during this webinar. Probably expect to get that sometime in the next 2 days. But once again, thank you so much for joining this webinar, and have a good night.
The company was insulted and infuriated. Again, playing the victim despite decades of high profits, near total domination of the country's economic development policy, and absurdly favorable contracts. Guatemalan autonomy was a threat. And United Fruit public relations consultant Edward Bernays was determined to neutralize that threat. Bernays was already 4 decades into a legendary career, having revolutionized the fields of advertising and public relations. He included celebrities, governments, and corporations among his long list of clients. Among his most famous innovations was a smoking campaign aimed at women, in which he linked women's liberation and autonomy to cigarettes. After consulting with the psychoanalyst, Bernays popularized the term torches of freedom and organized a public display of women smoking during a 1929 Easter parade. This public display shocked the public, as women smoking had been a taboo relegated to private spaces. Bernays was involved in casting the participants and ensuring professional photographs of the women were distributed worldwide, leading to a steady increase in smoking among women for years to come. Perhaps Bernays' most long-lasting contribution to history was his work on propaganda, having literally written the book Propaganda, published in 1928. Schlesinger and Kinzer quote from the book, quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate the unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically." End quote. Bernays also boasted of his strong ties to American print and broadcast media, with personal relationships to owners and publishers of papers such as the New York Times, among many others. He also gained a reputation as an ardent liberal and supporter of the New Deal, with close personal ties to the inner circle of FDR and a track record of funding and advocating for progressive causes. Upon acquiring United Fruit as a client in 1949, he leveraged all these connections and launched a campaign to turn American public opinion ardently against the Guatemalan government. His first act was to shift United Fruit PR policy away from secrecy and aversion to publicity towards openness and direct enthusiastic engagement with media and liberalism. This was done by providing journalists with vast but controlled access to company personnel and facilities. He set up a Middle America Information Bureau to provide fast and concise data to American and Latin American journalists. The company even began to found and fund newspaper operations aimed towards its own employees in Latin America. He also advocated improving some working conditions and infrastructure, providing better training and education for employees and greater business transparency for company investors. These later measures were intended to improve the company's image and create a more efficient operation, but Bernays encountered pushback from the company when results didn't immediately materialize. Bernays was undeterred from his strategy of appealing to liberal sentiment. He organized visits to Guatemala by journalists such as Fitzhugh Turner of the New York Herald Tribune, who based a series of articles, Communism in the Caribbean, mostly on prearranged interviews with United Fruit employees and officials. The story ran on the front pages of the Herald for 5 consecutive days.